Welcome, everyone. It truly is an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to have Eduardo Halfon with us today, and Shemtov, who is a lecturer of Hebrew literature, and myself, Héctor Hoyos. I'm an associate professor of Latin American literature at Stanford. Welcome you to this conversatorio, as one would say in Spanish, a conversation with Eduardo that has been made possible by the Department of Iberian and Latin American Cultures and by the Toby Center for Jewish Studies. Charlotte von Robert, thank you very much for this collaboration. This is indeed a special opportunity to have first two classes. There's two undergraduate classes that are meeting here. There is a class in the Latin American short story and also a class in the Jewish and Hebrew short story. As it happens, Eduardo Halfon's oeuvre sits
right in the middle.
Right in the middle. And yet, this kind of conversation is rather rare.
Very rare. And
so the way we're going to operate, if that seems like a good idea for everyone involved, is both Vered and I will be asking a series of questions to Eduardo, and we will converse amongst ourselves as these things sometimes go, but soon enough we'll also open it up to questions, so please have those questions ready for when the time comes. With that, I'll just pass the baton over to Vered.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for introducing me to Eduardo's work and bringing him here. And I'd like to start, my questions will come from the perspective of Hebrew and Jewish literature. And I'd like to ask you, what is Jewish literature for you? And do you think of yourself or your work as part of Jewish literature?
Wow.
Because we just placed you there, but I was not sure how
I'm very glad you started with an easy one. Well, first of all, thank you to everybody for making this possible. Héctor and Vered and Charlotte, who I'm meeting now, but I thank you. And to all of you for coming. I've met some of you yesterday over here. And I apologize in advance if I repeat myself in any of these answers, because we talked a little bit yesterday about all of this. I think it's perhaps best, Vered, to try to start with my relationship with Judaism. No? Because I can't speak about Jewish literature or my relationship with Jewish literature without speaking about my relationship with Judaism, and I think that's a good starting point. I have a relationship with Judaism, or I had, very similar to the relationship I have with Guatemala, actually. I've started to notice that in the last few years. I didn't notice that at the time, and it was mostly a relationship of rejection. I rejected both. And it was a very adolescent kind of rejection, very, very rebellious, you know. This is what you are. No, it's not. Why? So Guatemala first, so the Latin American side of my identity. I was born in Guatemala, and we left Guatemala with my family in 1981 on the day of my 10th birthday. We left the country. It was the internal war, the civil war was at its peak. They told me, we really didn't notice. It had come into the city, and we were fleeing. I use the word fleeing. My father still doesn't like that I use that word. But he'd sold the house and sold our things and said, we're going to Miami for a little while. But why'd you sell the house then? So there was mixed signals. And it was a fleeing. And they told us, myself, my brother, and my sister, we'll come back when things get better. Well, 12 years later, I finally went back. So I stayed in the U.S. the rest of schooling, high school, and university. I studied engineering. That's a different question. In North Carolina, in NC State. So I'm an engineer. I was never part of any literature at all growing up. No books, not interested, not for me. I arrived here very late, relatively speaking. I accidentally stumbled into literature when I was 28. But that again is a different question. I'm leaving all of these things scattered like pieces of bread so we can find our way back. So I go back to Guatemala when I'm 22 or 23, almost 23, without Spanish. I had lost my Spanish. We could understand it, my siblings and I, but we could barely speak. Our parents made it a point to speak to us in Spanish, but we would answer in English, and this was immediate. I was 10, and 1 or 2 months after arriving in South Florida, I just switched gears. I went straight into English, as children at that age do. So I went back to a country I didn't know, a language I didn't speak, culture that was completely alien to me. Remember, this is a country that is predominantly Catholic. 99% Catholic back then. Now it's Christian, but back then it was a Catholic country. And the Jewish community in Guatemala, they say, is 100 families. So it's about 600, 700 people. Gabi, you know this. And dwindling because there's nobody to marry besides your cousin. No? So people have to go to Mexico or go to Colombia or go to Miami to find a partner or leave Judaism, assimilate. Those are the only two options for a community that small. But growing up in that context is very strange because all of my friends were Catholic. All of the national holidays are Catholic. All of the speech is Catholic. So why don't I get a First Communion like my friends? And why don't I celebrate Christmas like all of my friends? And I remember this feeling of being outside, no? Of not really being there. It's almost like living in a diaspora. You're not really there. Or you're there, you're allowed to watch the game from the sidelines, but you're not allowed to play. No Christmas for you. No First Communion for you. No Easter for you. No, these are ours. You can watch us. So this mentality of always being outside, I've always had. I've always had. And then I arrive in the US, I start dressing American and speaking American, but I'm really not American. I've never become an American. So again, this phenomena of not belonging, no? And Judaism. So Judaism for me was exactly the same thing, no? We weren't really in a Jewish community. We were in Guatemala. I'm speaking as a child, from my childhood. Jewish, but not. No? I don't know. I'm guessing that's where a lot of my rejection stemmed from. The curious part of this rejection, which got worse and worse, as teenage years will do, is that I finally became interested in Judaism when I discovered literature.
When he discovered what?
Literature.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. When I started writing specifically, reading a little bit, but writing specifically, when I started writing, I started going back towards that part of me, and also the Guatemalan part of me. So those two parts of my identity, which are key in my stories, I started to rediscover, as I rediscovered my language. I finally started learning Spanish again through writing. And I only write in Spanish.
So I cannot
Now,
think.
again, Vedet, I didn't answer your question because I
Well,
didn't,
you actually did,
I did?
because I cannot think of a more of a better way to define Jewish literature as a literature that deals with its position as outsiders, as minority, that deals with identity,
Right.
rejection of identity, and also trying to accept and reject identity.
Right.
Everything you said, the multilingualism. So all of it is Jewish literature for me, and so you kind of you answered it, but I know that the answer also keeps you out of it and in it at the same time. Which then do you think of literature as a space of being at home, or of a place of exile, or difference, of the new?
Yeah,
So-
it's not a home either. Yeah, I also feel like an outsider here, which is strange to say because I've been here for 15 years now. No, I've been writing for 15 years. I've been publishing for 15 years. I should start feeling like this is, for me. I said recently, if this is my home, I'm renting. I feel that it's not. I'm here temporarily because I have something to say. Something's not right, and I need to get at it. But that'll go away. That'll either dissipate, or I'll run out of things to say, or I'll solve that riddle. No? So no, literature for me is also a place of diaspora. It's also a place of exile. It's also a place of not belonging. Yeah, it's similar to the rest of me, to the other pieces of my puzzle. Very similar.
And how is this position of not belonging? Is this a productive, important position for you in your work in general?
I
Is
think
this
so.
is the place from which you think?
Yeah.
And is this a difficult position for a short story? Somebody writing also short
That's a good
stories.
question. That is a great question. I think it's an important position for me to maintain. I don't do it consciously. Yeah, it's not something I want. It's just something that is part of me. I was taught to be this way, so it's not something I look for. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And as far as a short story, I only write short stories. That's my genre. That's where I feel comfortable. And I write in a very peculiar way. Do you want me to go into this?
Actually, yeah.
Yeah?
The process of writing would be interesting.
Okay. Yeah, let's rehash that I'm an engineer before I go into this because it's important. And when I say I'm an engineer, that's different than saying I studied engineering. I did study engineering, but I am very much an engineer. I've always been very methodical, extremely neurotic. I remember, to give you just a quick example of my neuroses, I remember when my grandfather, I was 7, or maybe 8, gave me my first stopwatch. And I discovered the stopwatch. Yeah? It was a Casio. You guys don't know what a Casio is. It's a big black watch, and I could stop and start time. I could measure time. And this to me was a huge discovery, that I could measure time. So I started timing everything. Everything. How long it would take my mom to smoke a cigarette, each nap my dad would take. And then I timed myself, and I remember this, getting dressed. So shirt first, pants, then socks, then shoes. Socks, then shirt, then... And I wrote down each measurement because if I could find a way to dress quicker, I could sleep more in the morning. So I don't know if that's neuroses or engineer-like, but I'm very much like that little boy still. Writing is the complete opposite. Complete opposite. I don't write from that spot, from that place. I write from somewhere else. I have no idea what I'm writing about when I start. I have an image. We spoke about this yesterday. I start from an image, usually. My grandfather's number. That was the image that started that story. Yeah? A snapshot, a memory, something that I have in my head. It's usually emotional, not a photograph per se, but an emotional memory. And I want to get to it somehow. And I start. And I don't know if that's going to be a 2-page story, a 100-page story, nothing. I don't know where it's headed. Yeah? So I don't plan it out. I am improvising in a way, or letting go in a way, or trying to let something else take control. Yeah? I don't know how to describe it. It's been tricky for an engineer to learn to write that way, to let go. But that's the only way I know how to write. I started writing that way. I'm still writing that way. So it's a very improvisational way of writing. At first, at first moment, in the first draft, yeah. Then there is engineering, but that's later. No, language really. No, engineering of language. The story's a little. This needs work. This is too much. Yeah. So there is a moment of cleaning up, of organizing, but that's much later. At first, is anti-engineer-like.
Do I have time for
You
one more
do,
question?
yes. So we agreed before that Vered would pose something like 3 questions, and I would pose 3 questions. This is the behind the scenes of this arrangement.
So I want to go back to the story and about your grandfather and the image of the number.
Right.
And ask you 2 questions about writing about the Holocaust. One is, was it different? Was it difficult, or just was the process different when it came to this image and to this topic? And the second question was, it was really interesting for me that later you decided to use the same story in order to speak about the relationship between reality and literature, and truth and the truth of literature, and the truth of historical truth.
Right.
So if you could say something a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think that is perhaps the most important story I will ever write. I don't think I will write a more important story. I think that's my story. No, I didn't know that at the time, but I know that now. I'm not done writing it. Hector knows a little bit what I'm talking about. I'm not done writing his story. This is my grandfather, by the way. Can you see him? That was taken in Berlin after he was liberated from Sachsenhausen. We think. I found this photo after his death, so we're not really sure. But I love the picture. It's one of 2 photos that we have in the family of him during that time, and we have one of his family that he was able to keep with him, which I'll show you later. So writing about the Holocaust. I think most people here have read that story. Yes? Okay. Most, I think. I hadn't started writing yet when I spoke to my grandfather. So I have to rewind a little bit. My grandfather was captured in '39, November of '39. So just as the Germans arrived in Poland, he was one of the first prisoners, and spent the entire war in camps. Survived. Later went to, he's Polish, he was born in Lodz, or Łódź. went to Cuba, New York, and eventually wound up in Guatemala, and remained silent about his experience for the next 60 years. He wouldn't speak of it. So I think it was in 1999, more or less, when I went up to my mother, so his daughter, and asked what camps he had been in. And she had no idea. Nobody had any idea of anything, because he wouldn't speak. He would say, this is my phone number to us. Don't ask. I'm not talking about this. So I went up to him and I said, do you want to talk? Can we speak for a bit? He said, yeah, sit down. And he pulled out a bottle of whiskey and I said, can I film this? Yeah, sure. So I put a video camera and he spoke for 6 hours with his, pants half open, because that's the way he would sit. So it's a very, very striking image, still, that video. And spoke very, very calmly about the 6 years. The timeline was unclear. He couldn't remember where he was first. Then they sent me, but the time was a mess. After 60 years of dust, there was a lot of dust on that memory. But he was very calm. And within those 5 or 6 hours, he told me an anecdote in 2 minutes, maybe less, of a boxer. Mm-hmm. So to him, this was an anecdote. It wasn't important. Oh yeah, they sent me to Auschwitz and I met a boxer and done. And I knew immediately that was the story I had to tell. I knew that was his story. I don't know why, it just resonated immediately to me. The implications of a boxer saving somebody or teaching somebody to fight with words. I think that idea is so beautiful. Not with fists, but with words. So I took that little anecdote and tucked it away and didn't do a thing for a while because I was very afraid. I was afraid of the subject matter. I was afraid of disappointing him, of offending his memory, of offending, this entire mountain of doubt came in. But during the next 4 or 5 years, I was writing stories. So, Distant, for example, and White Smoke, which which I think some of you read, correct? And what would happen, every time I would write a story, I would pull out this little anecdote and mention it, and then put it back away. So his little story about a boxer started creeping up in all of my stories. Without writing it. I hadn't written it yet. I was writing about everything else but that. There was a lot of resistance because of what you said. That's why when you read The Polish Boxer, it almost reads like a novel, with the grandfather story being almost an undercurrent. It's almost an undercurrent of all the stories, but that's because that was happening to me. I didn't write it that way for it to be an undercurrent. That's the way I was living it. Yeah? And I started trying to write it, and I tried third person, and I tried starting here, and I would do all kinds of things to distance myself from the story. Yeah? I didn't want to implicate myself with this narrative because of fear, probably. And I had that first paragraph. The first paragraph I wrote very early. That memory from childhood, that's the photograph, the phone number, the number itself. The number was the image. And then I figured something out that I spoke with you guys about yesterday. And I remember that I understood something, and it was almost like a door opening. Yeah? And it wasn't my grandfather's story that I wanted to write, but the story of a grandson in the moment he receives his grandfather's story. So in The Polish Boxer, if you guys remember, we keep going back into the narrator's head and into his imagination. Yeah, the camera keeps turning back to what he imagines. Where did my grandfather get the number? Oh, all of these scenarios. Then at the end, where do kids come from? Where do babies come from? So the camera keeps turning back to the grandson to see his reaction. Yeah? It wasn't a story about a grandfather. It was a story about a grandfather and his grandson. It was a story about a family story, about an inheritance. That's what was happening. At that moment, he was inheriting me. He was giving me my story, my family's story. Yeah? And then it was easy to write. Then it was this was 8 years. This was 8 years it took me from the moment we spoke and I filmed him to the writing of the story.
This is fascinating.
And then the second part of your question, which is also great, no? So, Beauvoir, did they read that?
Yes.
Okay.
Our class.
The speech at Beauvoir, right? Which just destroys everything that you just read, right? And so I was in Guatemala at that point, and I opened up the newspaper and saw this. You know, some Guatemalan reporter went with my grandfather and asked him, "How did you survive Auschwitz?" And my grandfather answered, "Because I was a carpenter, because of my skills as a carpenter." I said, "What are you talking about? You have no idea about carpentry." So I asked him, "Why did you answer that? Why did you tell him that?" And he was vague at first, and then he finally got to it. The reporter didn't deserve the other version. He would give people different versions of how he saved himself, depending on if they deserved him or not, according to him. So he was playing with reality. He was playing with fiction. He was inventing an alternative narrative, depending on the reader. If the reader wasn't a Jewish grandson, he wasn't giving him the truth, was he? So that's why when I wrote that small, it's not even really a story. It's almost like a speech, no? About reality and fiction. It just made complete sense to use that as an example. But in every book I've written since Vered, The Polish Boxer comes out in 2008 in Spain, the first version, the first incarnation, and then we'll talk a little bit about that later. In all of my books since, I've been continuing the story of my grandfather. I've been finding out more. Yeah? So I keep adding on to it in some way. My next book in English, which will come out early next year, has a story in it called "O Ghetto, My Love," which is my trip back to Poland and where I find his house. My new book in Spanish that is coming out this fall has a 5-page visit to Sachsenhausen, where I find out what he did there. He worked there, and he didn't tell us this. And I found out a really, really important piece of why he survived. But he never mentioned it. I had to go and scrounge and look, and I tell that. So I've been adding on to it. I don't know what the expression is. I don't know how to describe this. It's almost as if I'm going back to that original story, and I keep telling it. It keeps growing in his absence, because he passed away in 2010 or 2009, after my book was published. And that book was on his nightstand when he died. He never read it, of course, but it was there. His testimony stayed.
So this leaves me with a lot of questions, which I will not ask right now. And if we'll have time later, maybe we can.
I'm sure we will.
Continue.
Speaking of time, you were sharing with us that anecdote of timing the getting dressed quickly in the morning, which sounds like Taylorism, right? This idea that has structured our lives to a great extent.
Right.
2 comments about that, and I'll get to the question in a little while. One is almost logistical in nature. We are very regimented at Stanford. So you will notice that at one point some people might have to leave and others will come in. Don't think anything of it. It's just we're very regimented. And your writing isn't, which is I think very important. It's something that I really appreciate. By the standards of contemporary authors who are very successful like yourself, you have written precious few, and I think that's great. I don't know what your agents and publishers may say to that regard, but I find that the short stories and their various versions are very carefully crafted, and they go against the grain of, oh, don't bother really fixing that. You can always publish the next book and keep on producing. So I appreciate how it goes against the grain of that Taylorism which you were mentioning. My question, though, has to do with time, but also with space. The first one, I'm thinking of globalization, this thing that happened around the world after 1989. It had been happening, but it really intensified.
Right.
Where traveling became accessible for a great majority of people, and the kind of global experience that the Jewish diaspora had was in different ways accessible to a broader segment of society. It became mainstream. In other words, even if someone's grandparents do not come from a different continent, or people have not had the chance of corresponding with family in different countries, right? All of a sudden, everyone was becoming always already global, right? Very broadly, I'd like to ask you about that and remind readers of certain things. The short stories take place in Japan, Poland, Guatemala, Belize, Israel, various parts in the United States. The United States is actually very textured.
Very.
In your writing, which is not always the case, right? Or we have things like a literature student taking a short story class in Distant that will remark that what James Joyce says about Dubliners oddly applies to Guatemalans. So very open question, Latin America, globalization.
Right. I think one of the most important things in your question, Héctor, is this almost reading my stories almost feels like a diaspora in itself, no? And I think that comes from not having my own city or my own. I want my Dublin, but I don't have it. I would love to be a writer of one city or of one country that just spends his entire life writing about that city. I don't have that. So I keep going to places, either in my travels or in my imagination or in my literature, and trying to make them my own. Yeah? Whether it be Japan, which couldn't be further from my reality, no? Or Tecpan, the small city in Guatemala, which is also very distant from my reality, from that other Guatemala that I know, no? The capital city. So when I'm writing, since I don't have that sense of tierra propia, no? of roots, I keep looking for them, or I keep making the world my city, if you will, no? That sense of a global city is very clear if you read just one of my books. No? Just in Señor Hoffman, you go all over the place.
Right.
In 100 pages, you're traveling all over the place. That is not a consequence of globalization, I think. In my case, I'm not really aware of that. It's just more of una carencia in me. No, I lack earth. I lack my home. I don't have a home.
Right.
It's we go back again to this feeling of being uprooted, of not belonging, of being almost floating all the time. No, I'm here, but I'm not really here. I sound American, but I'm not really American. No, And when I'm in Guatemala, I can perfectly fit in, perfectly. And when I'm in Spain, they think I'm Spanish. It's a Zelig type existence, no?
Right.
Of adapting my physical appearance to where I'm at. It's a survival strategy, as Wittgenstein said, no? This chameleonic ability of Jews to pretend to fit in.
Right. But it's also interesting, though, just to follow up that something that has been specific to Jewish literature and to a Jewish experience. Not to belabor the point, right? But it's becoming more and more the norm.
Right.
For people, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, heritage. And so what I find fascinating is how this uprootedness in your literature, comes into circulation at a moment when many people are indeed uprooted. And those Dublins are nowhere to be found.
I agree.
Much as we want to claim something like Bogotá 39, and for some of you may know, it's a major literary festival, and it's a way of inscribing the city of Bogotá also in the global world of letters, right? Right. Redundancy aside, Bogotá is not there anymore. No. At the same time that it's claimed as the center of the Spanish-speaking world in terms of contemporary literature, right? Okay, but let me segue though into a question that takes off after you're saying that you're very comfortable in Guatemala. Your character.
I'm not very comfortable in Guatemala.
But you blend in. I think that's the words.
Yeah. Uncomfortably, but I blend in.
But you blend in. Okay.
Yeah. I pretend to be comfortable.
Okay. I'm sure there's truth to that, and I think for the record, the blending in is really important. Your character, though, does not blend in.
Ese otro Halfon.
Ese otro Halfon.
Right.
No, and there's the Borges and el otro Borges. There's the Halfon and el otro Halfon.
Right.
El otro Halfon does not blend in. There's a number of occasions in the short stories where, say, a villager from rural Guatemala will remark to el otro Halfon, you don't look Guatemalan, you don't sound Guatemalan, you don't dress Guatemalan. You play with all of those registers. At the same time, Guatemala is the birthplace of a really influential literary genre, right? Or its modern instantiation, which made huge waves in this university in the 1990s, namely Testimonio. Right. And in Testimonio, you have, say, Rigoberta Menchú, who is an indigenous woman who cannot write by herself in a sophisticated literary register, partner with an author, right, who speaks sort of like in a certain ventriloquism in her voice. Okay. So, same as I was posing the question, globalization and Halfon, or the other Halfon, how about testimonio, different testimonios, witnessing, right, and Halfon?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Because I immediately think of my technique in these stories, is testimonial-like. No quotes, no italics, one straight shot. It's almost like somebody telling you their testimony. Visually, I don't want there to be any interruption. This sounds trite, it sounds almost trivial, but I am adamant with translations to respect that. No quotes, no italics, especially when I use other languages, whether that language be Yiddish or Cachiquel, it must be unitalicized because it is a testimony. It is one person's voice, and we don't italicize our voice when we use other languages. So there is a reason for that, and the reason is testimonial. What's funny, I don't think I've told you this. I've written a manifesto, a one-page manifesto that I send my translators before they start. Because in some languages I can proofread and make sure they're respecting these ideas, But in Japanese I can't. Not too much, in Norwegian I can't. So my solution was, I'll tell them before they start, this is why I write the way I write. And that includes repetitions, that includes reiterations, that includes no italics, et cetera, et cetera. And it has to do with testimony. It has to do with making the narrator's voice testimonial-like as possible, no? In a literary register, but testimonial. That's one aspect of that word that I really like. The other aspect is what I'm really doing in my 13 books is giving you my testimony, isn't it? Or to use another word, Héctor, it's almost a confession. The problem is that word, like monastery, are not very Jewish words. No? You can't
But
use...
that's not a problem.
No. Actually, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That's why I chose it as a title, because it's almost, it resonates in a bad way, which becomes a good way, no? It's monastery, but Israel, that contradiction is very interesting. It's texture to it. As with the word confession. Thomas Mann used to say, make your work, haz de tu obra una sola confesión. Make your oeuvre
into one long confession.
And that is almost like giving your testimony, yeah? As a survivor or as you know, what Rigoberta Menchú does. You know? She gives her testimony, but she needs somebody else to translate it, to move it into another register.
The interesting difference there is that you need you and you.
Yeah.
Which is...
yeah. And I'm giving you his testimony, not mine.
Yes. This
guy smokes, I don't smoke. No, he smokes a lot. I wish I smoked. I'm too much of a coward to smoke, so I make him smoke. He's very intrepid. He travels really well. I am the world's worst traveler. I've become the world's worst traveler. You don't want to know. You don't want to know. I'm not going to go into it. There's a little bit in Monasterio if you want to read it. Suffice it to say that I travel with masking tape and blackout for my curtains in the hotels. Black plastic bags, actually, which I immediately use to cover up all the windows. I don't like planes. I don't like, I don't know. I've just become very complicated in my travels. He's not.
Right.
He just goes. No? I'm very, very comfortable at home. I like being at home. I'm not gregarious. I'm not social. So Nebraska is very, very fitting.
Is anyone here from Nebraska?
Yeah, before I go on. Yeah, there's no visitors in Nebraska. There's nothing to do, and that's perfect. I was telling you yesterday that I spent a semester in New York teaching 2 years ago, and it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. Just every day there was somebody who wanted to do something. There was somebody in town. There was this, book launch. There was something. Leave me alone. I cut it short. I went back to Nebraska early. That just sounds ridiculous, But I did. I went back a few weeks early. I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't work. There's too much distraction. So what was the question? Why am I speaking about this? Testimonials. Lo de Halfon. Yeah, there's almost this rupture that occurs, no? Yeah. Between the Halfon narrator and myself. He's got his own personality. He's got his own voice. It's not my voice. It's not my voice at all. And I can tell when it's him. And I can tell when it's him in an interview.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I can tell, especially written interviews, which I do more and more often. I can tell when I'm writing in his pen.
Wow. One of you can be a reluctant global citizen and the other a global citizen proper.
Yeah, he is. He's perfectly comfortable in Guatemala, for example.
Right.
No?
Eduardo, I have one more of the, shall we say, scripted questions before we open it up. And this is also a lead to the all-day event that will take place tomorrow on literature and human rights at the Terrace Room. You're cordially invited. This is also a collaboration, and Eduardo is going to be reading from his work tomorrow next to no other than Carmen Bullosa, right? So stay for that. My question leading to that has to do with human rights, because biographically, you happen to be at a certain distance from two, perhaps non-comparable, perhaps comparable, major human rights crises. The Holocaust, I mean, if there's ever been an understatement, right? But also the Guatemalan genocide, which used the term genocide that was, born in the context of human rights and the context of the Holocaust. It was applied to Guatemala because it was indeed the extermination of ethnicities, as systematic, horrendous. I don't know, Eduardo, if you've given thought. I mean, I know that you have given much thought, let me say, to human rights and literature in your writing. I think your writing is a theory of, thinking in very subtle ways about human rights and literature. But I was wondering if you would indulge us to maybe elaborate and tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think both of those experiences, although distant, they're both distant, Héctor, no? Because the Holocaust didn't happen to me. I see it through the prism of two generations. It's not even my parents, it's my grandfather. So it's very far removed, no? So I receive it from a distant past almost. But the Guatemalan genocide wasn't me either. No, it wasn't close. I was a kid, a very overprotected kid, secluded away in a very private school, where this was not spoken of, ever, while it was going on. This was in the 70s. Right. And we had no idea there was a war in the country. We had no idea. The war was mostly in the mountains, and in the late 70s it came into the city, 79, 80. So you started hearing gunshots at night and seeing more military checkpoints, but things didn't really register that something was going on, no? So that too was very far removed. That reality of the country, was kept from us. And when I say us, it's a whole generation of children of a certain class, no? So the middle, upper class children of Guatemala were kept from it. To this day, I don't think it's spoken of. I don't think it's taught in schools. Yeah. The term genocide is still very, very touchy in Guatemala. I said it in an interview last year, and my father received 4 or 5 hate phone calls from friends because his son was mentioning the word genocide. There's a segment of the population, which is very small, but very loud, that refuses to admit there was a genocide. It wasn't genocide according to them. It was a war. Right. It was a genocide. But the word scares them for some reason. So when I'm writing, I'm not thinking about all this. No, I'm not a political writer. I'm a liar, as I told you guys yesterday. I'm inventing stuff. I'm making up stories. But that's there. That's part of my luggage. Both of those experiences, although removed, are part of my identity. And we keep going back to that word, no? Identity. I don't know what it means, but it's almost like layers. Yeah? And there's some that are very, very close and some that are more removed, and those are very, very close. I'll give you an example. The story I'm reading tomorrow, no? Bamboo?
Yep.
I don't think you guys have read that. You have. Gabi, you have. Only you, though, because you're from Guatemala. The genesis of that story is very interesting. Le Monde Diplomatique asked me to write an essay about Guatemala. Yeah? About Guatemala's reality or social problems. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. That's not the type of writer I am. But I can write a story in which I'm going to try to make you feel that. I'm not going to tell it to you. And I'm not going to explain it to you because I can't do that. But I can try, if I do my job, to make you feel it. Yeah? And I think in that story it works. I think there's something that happened in that story, which to date, that and The Polish Boxer are the most translated, the most anthologized. This little story that I wrote, I think it's 5 pages, no? Mm-hmm. Of just a trip to the beach. That's all it is. It's a trip, it's a morning trip to the beach. And what I see is my way of tapping into it, of showing it, of getting you inside of it. That's more what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to get the reader inside of that reality. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And I think that's much more profound than explaining it to you.
And, eye of the reader who wants quick answers, right?
Right.
To really complex problems. Right. The floor is open. Please, we have something like 15 minutes for questions, and then we have a reception, so don't be shy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. I really enjoyed listening to you. And I just wanted to ask you a question. You brought up the point of translation.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. I'm in Pereda's class, and so all the stories that we've read by you are in English.
Right.
And I was just curious, since you said that you write in Spanish, when you read stories, like for example in English, do you feel that what you've read so far, like you read that, and are you like, oh, like that gets across what I wanted?
Right.
Or are there certain, I guess, like what areas do you look at
Okay.
and think that that's just wrong or off or could be improved?
That's a great question. That's a great question, especially when I'm translated into English. Because when I'm writing these stories, they're in my head in English. They come out in Spanish for some reason, but I'm thinking in English. I know what I want to say in English, and I have to adapt the Spanish to say it. That was much more evident to me at the beginning when I started writing. Now it's much more organic and natural, but I'm still more on the English side of language than on the Spanish. My English is much, much stronger. I prefer to read in English. So these stories that you read, started in English, went into Spanish, and now somebody else is taking them back to their original language. It's very bizarre, right? Very strange, and very strange for me. So what happened is they would give me their translation, and I would say, no, this is all wrong. This is not what was in my head. You missed. I said, no, that is what you're saying. Yeah, but that's not what was in my, but that is what you wrote. So it was very hard into English. Yeah. To make matters worse, the stories you guys read had 5 translators. It was a team of translators. Don't ask. They workshopped the stories, so to speak. Yeah. So it was the 5 of them and myself. It was 6 of us, really, and we started negotiating. This yes, this no, this. It was very, very tricky. So in English, it was a special case, so to speak. Other languages, much less so. No, I can speak French, so I was a little bit involved with that. I can read the Italian, I can read the Portuguese, but not. I don't dominate those languages. I'm not fluent, so I can't give an opinion. Yeah, I can just say, this sentence sounds a little wrong, or this sentence needs to be flipped, because sometimes I want the effect at the end of the sentence, not in the middle. I think most of my translators would rather me not be involved. Yeah, I'm much too involved because of what you were saying, Héctor. I'm so aware of language. No, it's and this is what I think we have most in common as short story writers with poets. There's a similarity in that each word really counts in the short story as in the poem. Or that's my sensation anyways when I'm writing and when I'm reading the translations. But that's a very good question. It's very tricky when the writer's alive. I think. And I'm sure my translators would say something else entirely if you ask them. But it's very, very tricky. You have to find a balance. It's almost learning how to write the two of you together. Yeah? Anyways.
Professor Gonzalez?
I would like to pick up something that maybe Héctor raised in the last question about the relationship between your writing and human rights
Right.
literature in general. And one of the things that concerns human rights currently is the debate about memory and forgetting.
Right.
And I think that is present in your writing.
It is.
The idea of memory and forgetting.
Yes.
So it seems that at some point the construction of identity of Jewish people had to do a lot more with forgetting than actually with remembering. So how do you see that relationship between the building of identity and like our need to memorialize or remember as a current predicament of our contemporary political categories, and how do you relate that with maybe a generation earlier of Jewish who actually thought that it was more in the side of forgetting or perhaps keeping that underneath the carpet, and how do you relate as a writer to that tension that maybe is present in your poetry?
That's very interesting. Very interesting in the fact that memory is absolutely perfect for fiction, no? because memory is not a permanent thing. No? My grandfather's memory of what happened to him is not what happened to him. And I'm sure his testimony or his answer would have varied every 10 years. You know? He would have molded it a little bit. So there isn't an actual event in his memory. It's more of a liquid. No? He wanted to forget. He wanted to forget. And he tried very hard, I think, for 60 years to forget and to have all of us forget. But something happened at the end of his life, I don't know what, that flipped that. And it suddenly became important to him without him knowing it. He never verbalized this to me. But it became important for that memory or that event or that testimony to stay behind. And that's why I mentioned that the book was on his nightstand. I think that's why he talked to me. I think that's why he said yes. Yeah? I'm going to tell this to my grandson who's the writer. I think there was a little bit of that, no? In terms of Guatemalan, and what happened during the war, and the testimonials that are recopilados, ¿cuál es el libro? La memoria histórica.
De las atrocidades en Guatemala. ¿Es como Nunca Más? No.
Nunca Más es, ¿no?
Nunca Más, la de Guatemala.
Sí. De la Comisión de Derechos Humanos.
Sí.
Yeah, they tried to get those testimonies as soon as possible. Yeah, they were all taken by United Nations Commission, no?
Right.
And there was this point, I remember during those years, of getting them now. We have to get them now. Before forgetfulness, before fear. You know, there was a sense of what will happen to me if I tell you what happened, if I give you my testimony. So there was a rush to fixate that memory, to fix it, no, on paper. Very different. And with Holocaust survivors, Pereda, I'm sure you've seen this as well. You have the survivors that will not talk, and then you have the survivors that will do nothing but talk, and that they see it as a responsibility, Primo Levi, etc., I must speak. I must speak of this. So the word there, la palabra, no, very different in Spanish, becomes very important. The lack of words, el silencio, which you name forgetfulness, but I think it's más un silencio, no? Or la palabra is that's where I'm situated, right in between those two phenomena, of forgetting and remembering.
I think there are other examples in Hebrew literature of moving from not talking to talking about it.
About the Holocaust.
Yeah, like Savion Liebrecht. Sorry.
Right, that's right.
It seems to me that it is the dynamics between remembering the forgetting that keeps something alive.
I think so.
That if not, it would be stories that are frozen, that have been told in the same way
Yeah.
a lot of times.
Right.
Sorry.
I was hoping you could say a little bit more about your relationship with the Spanish language, forgetting it and then relearning it, and especially how that relates to the way you identify or not with Guatemala
Right.
and maybe the multinational Latino community that you must have.
Right. I think the sub-question to your question is, why do I write in Spanish? No? Why didn't I just start in English? Yeah, my relationship with Spanish is very interesting. No? Why write in Spanish? I think that's the key question there. It wasn't a decision. When I started writing, I just started writing in Spanish. I never thought about it. I don't think I've talked about this, but my way into literature was very, very accidental. I sort of mentioned it at the beginning, but it has to do with language, I think. I was back in Guatemala, I was working as an engineer, etc. No? I was completely out of place. And this feeling of being out of place kept getting worse and worse and worse, and it went on for 4 or 5 years. And when I was 28, I went to the university, one of the universities, the Jesuit University in Guatemala, La Landívar, and wanted to enroll in a couple of philosophy courses, thinking that maybe philosophy could help me understand this existential angst I was feeling. And in Guatemala, it's a joint degree, it's Letras y Filosofía. In Colombia, no, ¿verdad? Ya no me dijiste. Ya no. Guatemala still is. It's a joint degree, so they said if you want to take philosophy, you have to take literature. And I was forced to enroll in 2 lit courses. And I immediately fell in love with books, with fiction. Immediately. I don't know why, I don't know what happened at that moment. I had never read. I was not a reader. There were no readers in my family. There was no books in my... there was something about fiction that just enveloped me. And I started reading a lot. And I was in Guatemala. No? So my way back to Spanish started there. It didn't start when I arrived back in Guatemala. It started when I started reading. And I started reading like a madman. I just could not get enough. I was a junkie. I became a junkie of fiction. I quit. I started working part-time as an engineer in the mornings and would read all afternoon. Read a book a day. The worst type of student, because they would, I was at the university and they would say, all right, read Madame Bovary, and I would go home and read all of Flaubert and come back with everything read. I just could not get enough. No? The consequence of that was writing. Writing to me was just a reaction to so much reading. Yeah? The overflow of filling myself with books. Eventually, 2 or 3 years later, I started writing. And I started writing in Spanish. Why Spanish? One answer is because I was in Guatemala. I was back in Guatemala and everything was happening in Spanish and I started Spanish. But that's not a pretty answer. There's a prettier answer. Because my childhood was in Spanish. Yeah? Not my mother tongue, but my childhood. My grandfather's phone number. Those first 10 years, those images that I had were all in Spanish. And literature, art in general, but literature, I know, is a way of going back there. There's things there that are important. The relationship with my sister and my brother, the relationship with my father. That's all there in those first 10 years. And all of that was in Spanish. So I think it was important for me to do it in Spanish. And then you asked about Latinoamericanos.
Yeah, I was
I think so.
And Latinos in Guatemala, or more broadly just in Latin America?
Well, I think it's perceived differently by Spaniards, more so. No, I think most Latin Americans, we understand each other. We understand the differences between Mexico and Guatemala and Colombia and Chile. We know we speak variations and we like it. No, we get it. We might not understand all the words, but we get what you're saying. Even if it's something a little naughty, we get it. No, Spaniards not so much. So they'll try to fix it a little bit or translate it into their own Spanish, which doesn't. It's not going to go. No. What's very interesting, you mentioned Bogotá 39, which was 10 years ago?
Yep, already.
So it was 39 of us in Bogotá. Supposedly a sample, no, of what was happening in Latin American literature. Some didn't write in Spanish. Junot, Alarcón, no? They were in the States writing in English. Half of the 39 weren't even living in Latin America. They were in Spain, they were in France, they were in the States, they were all over the place. So what unites us, if it's not geography or language? Something unites us. There's this sense of being Latin American. I don't think there's a sense of being Central American, but there is a sense of being Latin American. There's a Latin American feeling that we have. No? What is it? And how do you define that? It was a question during those days 10 years ago. What defines you? What are you writing about? What is your boom? And there was never an answer. There's still not an answer, I think. Cosmopolita, globalization. There was all these words thrown around, but that's not really it either. No. But there is a Latin American thing that is very important, and that I feel. Yeah.
Just on a side note, I came to realize I was Latin American in the States while doing a PhD.
Sí.
Prior to that, I was Colombian.
Sí. Sí.
And all of a sudden, I discovered, oh, look, I am Latin American. So there's that, right? It's we do have time for a couple more questions. I do want to hear from other folks. Claire?
This is kind of an extension of earlier questions about language and translation.
Right.
And that is, both, have you ever, out of curiosity, attempted to write in English to see what you would produce? And have you ever attempted to translate your own work from Spanish to English?
I have written in English. I will write in English when asked to. So if the Guardian asked me to write something, I wrote a piece for them, or Granta asked for something. So when I'm asked to and paid to, I will. But if not, no. You know what I thought, Claire? I thought that once I came back to the States in 2010 to Nebraska, I'd changed registers, and it didn't happen. It hasn't happened. I'm still writing in Nebraska, writing in Spanish. So only when asked to. And translating, I have, and I tried, and I decided not to because I was rewriting too much. No, I was making a completely different version of that story, which is valid, but then it's not a translation. So the solution I came up with is finding 2 or 3 really, really good translators that are really, really good friends, and that we develop this working style. And they send me their first draft, and they know I'm going to tear it up, and rewrite and move, and then we work on it together. And what we do now, actually the translators coming to Nebraska in October, we'll do the final draft together in person, which is great. It's a great pretext just to get together and see friends and work in person. But so no.
You mentioned that most of your friends in Guatemala were Catholic. And when you go back today and you see these people that you grew up with, presumably, where does Judaism fit in, or is it there at all? Does it ever come? It's just not mentioned.
It's in my family. My family is very, Jewish, in the traditional sense of the word. They're not practicing Jews, but they're still very. I'm trying to be nice here. They're still very, very. It's very important to them, yeah. So what I write is a little touchy, to them. just the fact that I question my Judaism offends them. And I think you understand where I'm coming from with this. Only Jews ask the question, why am I Jewish? How am I Jewish? What does it mean that I'm Jewish? Catholics don't ask that question. It's not a question. It's a very Jewish question. It's a very Jewish question in literature as well, no? And in film.
We just discussed it in class, and we have some Israelis in the class, and we got a different perspective about from Israelis that it is maybe a Jewish thing outside
of Israel.
Uh-huh.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. Well, it is a very common thing in Jews outside of Israel. Very common. In Latin America, in the United States especially. No?
Yeah, so maybe it is a minority thing.
It's a minority thing. Yeah.
I don't know.
No. So no, amongst my friends, no, but in my family, yes. Yeah, it's still there. It's still very, very present.
Charlotte?
Thank you. I have one personal question and one about Germany.
Charlotte, I saw that you have the German edition of the book.
Yes, because I want to understand it. I wonder about the story, the Polish boxer, your grandfather. Did you write it when he was still alive?
Yes. Yes.
So it was published when he was still alive?
It was published, and my mother read it to him, she told me. So he heard it from her. And that's why I mentioned that the book was on his nightstand when he passed. Yeah, so he knew of the book. She read it to him. She read it to him, and she said he cried the whole time. I don't think he got it. He had a really, really bad last 2 or 3 years. Especially the last year of his life was really, really bad. I think the entire experience of the Holocaust came back in a very strong way. He couldn't sleep. They couldn't put him to sleep. There wasn't a pill strong enough to make him, so he'd spend 3 or 4 days without sleep. He thought there were Germans in the room waiting for him, and he'd speak to them in German. So he was with a certain dementia at the end. So he wasn't aware of what was going on. But yes, I wrote it during his lifetime. He knew of it, and then he passed.
And then I wonder about the German reception.
Yeah.
There's been
Yeah.
a lot of reception.
A lot, and very good. And very good, yeah.
And whether, you've been in Berlin, whether the reception of you there and your perception is more as a Jewish writer or as a Latin American
That's a
writer.
very good question.
This edition has in the back a bunch of, just Latin American quote-unquote literature,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I don't know whether how you relate to that.
Germany to me was very interesting because there was a lot of resistance. They didn't want to publish. There was this editorial resistance. Yeah, I think because of the subject matter, and it's very touchy in Germany. You know? And then Hanser bought the book, and the reception was fantastic. It's probably the best reviews I've ever gotten in Germany. I don't know where that comes from, if from a good place or a guilt place, I don't know. I think you know German, so you might be able to read more into this. I believe that Hanser sold me as both, yeah? And especially this is a Latin American Jewish writer, so that combination is very exotic. It's not that common, I think. But it worked. And then they published the second book, and now they're publishing the third, so Germany's working. Exacto. This is a Guatemalan. It's not an Argentinian or a Mexican. It's a Guatemalan, which is also strange. It's even stranger, no?
And it's not Roberto Bolaño who has novels like this.
No.
But short stories.
Well, that's not entirely true.
No, of course.
We haven't talked about that part of it. The editorial part of what's happening with my book. Because if you see, The Polish Boxer in Spanish is a 100-page book. It's a very thin 6-story collection. The German book that you have there, or the English book, are twice as long. It's not because of the translation. It's 10 stories. It's not 6. The Japanese version of The Polish Boxer, which came out last year, is 15 stories. Wow. The French version of The Polish Boxer is 2 stories.
Well, what does that mean? That they took the same thing and broke it up in a different way?
Do we have time for this?
It probably should be our last, yeah.
Do you want me to show it or do you want me to tell it? Show or tell? What do you guys want?
Show and tell.
Show and tell. All right, let's do this. So this, by the way, is the photo of my grandfather's family. The only photo he was able to take away. That's him. And this was a photo taken right before his capture. And I think you can tell in their faces. There's no happiness. There's no joy. There's something happening, no? I can tell. That's his younger brother who died in the Lodz ghetto of hunger. I found out. The family didn't know. I found that out 2 years ago by going. His 2 sisters also died there, and his 2 parents died in Auschwitz, we believe. But that's the only photo of his family he ever had. And then, I'll do this very quickly, because I think that's the original book, okay? The original Spanish book, and those are the 6 stories, which I think some of you have read, some of you have read some of them, Distant, White Smoke, etc., etc. 2008. 2010, I published The Pirouette, which is those 3 stories. Epistrophe becomes a chapter of The Pirouette. So there's 2 versions of Epistrophe, the story version and the chapter version, which is a longer, more elaborated version. It's a second version of that original story. Okay? Then, 3 years later, it's Monastery. So those 3 stories. And it's The Pirouette is a trip to Serbia. Monastery is a trip to Israel. White Smoke, one of the original stories of The Polish Boxer, becomes a chapter of Monastery. So The Polish Boxer starts giving birth, so to speak, to other books. It becomes like the mother book. Okay? And then 2 years ago, Senor Hoffman, which is those 6 stories, continue some of the stories of The Polish Boxer. So, O Ghetto, My Love, Senor Hoffman, it's going back to my grandfather's story in a way. So you have these pieces, all of these stories on the table. All are separate stories. All are independent stories, written as independent pieces, okay? And what started happening? That's Spain's edition, which is also Brazil's edition. Brazil decided to publish the exact same edition as Spain. France said, no, we just want those 2 stories. And they published the most beautiful, small, 50-page book with the photo of my grandfather in a bicycle with the photos. Absolutely beautiful. So it's the story and the anti-story that you guys read, no, in your class. Italy added these 2 stories to the Polish Boxer. They decided to add those 2. US and Germany added The Pirouette and 1 story of Monastery, which is my grandfather's deathbed story, the last story of the book. So it's those 2. And Croatia did the same thing last month. The Croatian version is the same as that. But then the Japanese came, and I'm waiting for somebody to just make one big circle. In other words, it's 1 book. If you guys wait till I'm done, it is 1 big book that I'm writing. I'm just publishing it as I go along.
I think the French will come again with La Pléiade and make it 1 big book.
I agree.
Eduardo, thank you so very much.
Terminamos, ¿qué tiempo? one little side note is that when we do this with each edition, I have to sit down with each translator and each editor and work out the order of those stories. It's not just, here are the stories. They have to appear to be one voyage, one trip, yeah? And the placing of those stories is key, this engineer, no? But the content of the stories can also vary, yeah? So I might have to add a paragraph in Japanese so that makes sense over there. So each version of the Polish Boxer is absolutely an original, absolutely.